The next topic on our agenda is population ecology. And in order to illustrate what population ecology is, I'd like to tell you a story about European hares. In 1859, a wealthy gentleman decided to purchase some land in Australia. He was going to move there. He kind of set up a big old ranch. Now, he was a bit of a hunter, and one thing he thought, I'm going to really miss from Europe is hunting European hares, European rabbits, because Australia, they mostly have marsupials there, and there's just no sport in hunting koalas. So he came up with a solution. He's going to have this big plot of land, he'll put a fence around it, and he's going to bring 12 pairs of European rabbits, so 24 rabbits. He's going to release them on his ranch, and he'll hunt them every year, but he's not going to kill 24. There'll be enough left over. They'll breed with each other. He'll hunt them some more. He'll bring down the population. They'll breed. Bring down the population. They'll breed. It'll go perfect. And this seems like it would be common sense. It seems like this plan should work if you're unfamiliar with the mathematics of reproduction. By 1865, 6 years later, there were 20,000 rabbits killed on that ranch. So we went from 24 rabbits total to 20,000 rabbits killed on that ranch. That's not how many rabbits there were. That's how many they were able to eliminate from the population that year. So there were more than 20,000 rabbits. By 1900, there were several 100 million rabbits distributed over most of the Australian continent. And these rabbits, they do what rabbits do. They eat ground cover plants. They eat grass. They eat dandelions. They eat all kinds of ground cover plants, and it completely disrupted the natural ecosystem of Australia. They were a massive, what we call invasive species. Typically, invasive species are non-native species, not always, but they're usually a non-native species, whose population growth completely devastates the ecology of any other location in which they find themselves. It's a situation where the massive population growth of one species causes the populations of other species to plummet. And that's what population ecology is all about. Monitoring and looking at patterns in population growth and trying to figure out, why is this population growing fast? Why is it shrinking? Why is this population going towards extinction? Is this population stable? Is there anything we can do to bring this population up a little bit more? What's going on with these population numbers? So a population is a group of organisms, all of the same species. Population ecology has to do with the mathematics of reproduction. And the equation for what a population's number is going to be next year is pretty simple. It's just you take the total number of them this year, add the total number of new organisms born, subtract the total number of those organisms that die, and then you arrive at how many there's going to be next year. What our rancher did not take into account is that this is going to be an exponential population growth curve. The reason for this is that rabbits in their natural habitat are susceptible to diseases. They are susceptible to predators that live in that natural habitat that hunt these rabbits, that have specifically evolved in those areas to hunt these rabbits. They have a lot of competition for all the food resources in those locations. They are limited by the intense conditions of the seasons. Cold winters kind of dampen their ability to reproduce and survive, and that kills off large numbers of them. When they got to Australia, a lot of these factors just went away. There was lots and lots of food available for the rabbits. There were almost no natural predators around that considered rabbits to be a normal kind of food. It takes a while for predators to look at an organism and say, yeah, I want to eat that. They need to develop what's called a search image for a new kind of prey species before they are willing to try to eat it. The winters weren't as harsh. There were no diseases that were killing off the rabbits. So all of the factors that usually caused a lot of deaths in rabbit populations went away. And remember what I said, the population of rabbits next year is the population this year minus deaths plus births. Well, if the minus deaths factor has been reduced, that's going to cause there to be a lot more rabbits next year. So take a look at this graph. I prepared a little bit of an animation here. This green rabbit right here at the bottom represents the 24 rabbits that were introduced at time point 0. And then every tick mark on the x-axis is 7 months worth of time. After 7 months, that was the doubling time, we had 48 rabbits. They managed to breed enough, because this is what rabbits do after all. They make more rabbits. That's one of the things they're most famous for. That was the doubling time, so we had 48 rabbits by the end of that time. After 14 months, those 48 rabbits, well, now we have 96 rabbits. 21 months, now we have twice as many rabbits. 28 months, whoosh, we are way off the chart. And you can see how this is creating a J-shaped growth curve here, where it gets steeper and steeper and steeper the further we go in time. So not only is the population growing, it's growing faster and faster and faster because the population's doubling at every 7 months. So this is the first fact about population ecology that you should write down. All populations of organisms, any organism, will grow exponentially if they're given ideal conditions. That means there are no limiting factors. There's unlimited space for them. There's plenty of food. They have no competition from other organisms. There's limited predators around. They're not experiencing diseases. There's nothing keeping their growth numbers down. Because all species make excessive numbers of offspring, essentially assuming that there are going to be some limiting factors that prevent some members of their population from surviving to adulthood, if you give them ideal conditions, you're going to get exponential population growth as a result, which gives you this J-shaped growth curve. So the exponential population growth model, and here it is on the next chart, describes the expansion of a population in an ideal or unlimited environment, which is what Australia was when the rabbits were first introduced. Now, it's pretty rare that an organism would find a completely unlimited environment. However, anytime a population is very, very small, it simulates that condition because their competition from other members of their own species is going to be pretty small, and the number of resources compared to the overall population size is going to be big. So if you have a really small population size, it's like you have an unlimited environment. And then as your population grows, then limiting factors will start to be more and more of a problem. What happened with the rabbits was that Australia is such a big continent, and this was the first time rabbits had ever been introduced there, that they were able to continue growing and growing and growing and growing really, really large before they managed to reach any kind of carrying capacity in that ecosystem. The carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals that an ecosystem can hold. So we realized the problem, and we got clever. And what is usually the case with human history is we only get a little bit clever. We don't go all the way. So we realized that the problem with these rabbits was they were becoming an invasive species because there were no limiting factors, there were no predators keeping their population down. That's why they were able to expand so rapidly. So let's introduce some predators. Let's take a predator from their native habitat, European red fox, and introduce it to Australia, and they will eat all of the rabbits. They will keep all this rabbit population down, and that should reduce the rate of reproduction, and then every year we'll have fewer and fewer rabbits being added to the population, and that will they'll keep the population down. And then we introduced those European red foxes, and the red foxes got here, and they said, wow, rabbits are hard to catch. They have always been hard to catch, but in our environment, they were one of the only things that we had to chase after. But wow, Australia, this is a great place. It's warm, and there's all these great ground nesting baby birds around, and all of these small marsupials and other small mammals around. And boy, it seems like that is a much better food source for us than these European hares. So the foxes basically did nothing to impede the rabbits' reproduction. They didn't bother hunting them at all. They just went and they ate all of the baby birds and marsupials and other small mammals that they could find across Australia, and they became their own invasive species because they too had no natural predators. They too had no diseases on this new continent. They too had a small population with ample resources in front of them, so their population growth curve also became exponential. So now we had two invasive species on Australia. And Australia has countless stories of people introducing a species and then it becoming an invasive species. Partly because when the continents, initially we had big supercontinents, right? And Australia broke off from Pangaea a little bit earlier than some of the other continents did. So it's been having its own evolutionary ecosystem for quite some time. When species come from the mainland, from other continents, I should say, not the mainland because it's its own continent, and they're introduced to Australia, it's the first time very often that an organism of that type has ever been introduced to that location, so they tend to become invasive species because no organism with those types of adaptations has ever been on that location before, in that ecosystem. So what they attempted to do is called biological control. It's a vocabulary term. That is introducing one species as a predator to try to keep down the population of another species. Another way that we do this is that we sometimes use bacteria in order to reduce insect populations. If you're an organic gardener, you probably don't use artificial pesticides to keep down the pest population in your garden, but you may spray your vegetables with a kind of bacteria. It comes in a little spray, and that bacteria gets on the leaves, and it's harmless to humans. Most bacteria are harmless to humans, but it is very specific that it destroys the internal digestive system of caterpillars. So this will kill caterpillars that would be eating your vegetable leaves, but it will not harm humans that are eating the vegetables. Wash your vegetables anyway, but it should be harmless. When you're going to do biological control, you have to do experiments ahead of time. You have to double check and verify that the only organism that is going to be eaten or affected by the predator or whatever it is that you're introducing to try to control another population is going to be the target population. That's the only one going to be affected by it, because otherwise you risk introducing a new invasive species. So the foxes ate several species of native birds and mammals to extinction, spread across Australia, and had virtually no impact on the rabbit population. And this is the paradox of invasive species. You're actually adding a species to the ecosystem, but because they drive the populations of so many other species down, and some of them even to extinction, you're actually lowering the biodiversity of that ecosystem. There's fewer types of organisms in that area because of the invasive species. Now, not every non-native species is going to become invasive if it's introduced to a new area, and in fact, it doesn't have to be a non-native to become invasive. It's any species that has a population growth that is so fast that it impedes the biodiversity of the ecosystem. That's effectively what a invasive species is. The most likely candidates to become invasive species are organisms with what we call an opportunistic life history. Organisms with opportunistic life histories have short lifespans, very, very short lifespans. So that means, maybe 1 year, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, but typically very, very short. And because they don't live very long, their bodies are usually not very large and complex. They're pretty frail. They're disposable. So if they're not going to live very long and their bodies are pretty frail, how does a species like that ever actually manage to survive? Like generation to generation, you would imagine they'd be wiped out pretty fast. Well, organisms with opportunistic life histories tend to have lots of offspring, lots and lots and lots and lots of offspring. While the likelihood of survival of any one of the members of the population is pretty low, If you have thousands of offspring, chances are a few of them are going to make it to reproductive maturity, and then each one of the ones that survives and reproduces, they can have thousands of offspring. Only a few of them are going to survive, but each of the survivors can have thousands of offspring. And it's a strategy for making sure that some of your offspring survive. So organisms with opportunistic life histories, small bodies, short lifespans, pretty frail, have lots and lots of reproduction, lots of offspring, but they don't spend any amount of time or resources on parental care. They do not take care of their offspring. They just, it's the shotgun approach to reproduction. Just spread as much of your offspring around as possible. So give you an idea of why this is so effective, or why this causes invasive species. Take a dandelion here. Imagine we have one dandelion in a field. Or maybe this is a group of dandelions. Now, I have a little animation planned here. What's going to happen is this dandelion is going to reproduce. So now there's twice as many dandelions, and both of them are going to reproduce. Then the original dandelion will die, and every time they reproduce, the originals will die, but they're making twice as many offspring as the number that are dying. So as long as the rate of reproduction is higher than the rate of death every year, you're going to get more and more and more, and you'll get that exponential growth curve, right? Let's watch that again one more time, right? Every 2 seasons, we get reproduction and death. So reproduction, death, reproduction, death, reproduction, death. And as long as the rate of reproduction is faster than the rate of death, then the population will keep growing and spreading and growing and growing and growing. So dandelions have an opportunistic life history. They reproduce in great numbers, allowing them to dominate ecosystems after a disturbance. So imagine a wildfire comes through and it burns down a forest, right? So everything's decimated. What are the first life forms that are going to pop up after that forest fire comes through? It's not going to be oak trees, right? You're not going to have a whole bunch of oak trees sprouting up. Dandelions are going to be one of the first things that pop up after that, like dandelions and grasses, things that reproduce really, really quickly and have short lifespans because they are able to grow up real fast and then reproduce real fast, spread their seeds, and then you get more of them and more of them and more of them. This is why they're called opportunistic. They can't compete with larger, longer-lived, hardier organisms, but if something happens to upset the balance of the ecosystem, some disturbance like a storm or disaster comes through, wildfire, they're going to be the ones that are the first ones to regrow that area. They'll begin the process, filling it back in. So it reaches sexual maturity quickly, have short lifespans, and reproduce in what we call boom and bust cycles. And I'll show you that in a little bit, but it basically means that they grow up to their carrying capacity. Their population will increase and increase and increase and increase and increase, and they'll hit their carrying capacity, the maximum number of individuals that the ecosystem can carry. But because they reproduce so rapidly, they will actually continue to reproduce more and more and more and more. You'll keep getting more of them way past that carrying capacity. But now there won't be enough resources to support them. So you're going to get mass starvation, or there's not going to be enough water to support them, or there's not going to be enough sunlight to support them. Whatever the main limiting factor is, there's just not going to be enough for that new population. And you'll get a population crash, which is why we call it a boom and bust cycle. Another vocabulary word from our learning objectives here, biotic potential. The biotic potential is the ability of a population to increase under ideal environmental conditions. So some populations will be able to reproduce very, very rapidly. They have a high biotic potential. Others, even under ideal conditions, they're still going to reproduce relatively slowly. Elephants, for example, they only have one offspring every couple of years. So they're still going to reproduce relatively slowly compared to, say, dandelions or insects or rabbits or something like that. They're going to have a lower biotic potential. An organism's rate of reproduction and the size of each litter are the primary determining factors of biotic potential. So here we go. Here's a boom and bust cycle. Now this graph is for reindeer because this is real data and it's a really good graph for this kind of thing. But reindeer I wouldn't actually consider to be a opportunistic species. It's just we happen to have data for this. And any species will grow exponentially if given ideal conditions. So, in this situation, we had an area where they had eliminated all of the wolves from I believe this was from a national park. And as a result, all of the reindeer had no predators. So that main limiting factor that was holding them at their carrying capacity went away. And they had massive reproduction, exponential growth curve, right? So you have this nice J-shaped growth curve. You can see here, they have a population boom. But those wolves have been holding them at the carrying capacity of this ecosystem. So after they have this massive amount of population growth, the population gets to a point where there's not enough resources in the ecosystem in terms of vegetation, in terms of space, for this group of reindeer to actually survive. So mass die-offs start. They start starving. They start dying off really fast, and you get a population crash where it falls way under its carrying capacity. No species can overshoot their carrying capacity forever. If you shoot past it, eventually the population will crash back down because you need materials to support a large size like that. You need energy to support a large size like that. That's not a guideline. That is one of the fundamental laws of physics. Living things are systems made of meat, made of bone. You need material to grow those components. You need energy to pump a heart. You need energy to use your lungs. You need energy to be able to think and react to things. So without those resources, you're going to have a population crash, and the carrying capacity determines how much of that is available to your population. You overshoot it, you get a population crash. So from an evolutionary standpoint, you want to have the most offspring that manage to survive long enough to reproduce themselves so that every generation, more and more of your genes are accumulating in the gene pool of the next generation. So you want to have the largest share of surviving fertile offspring every generation. You can see why the opportunistic life history, the opportunistic species, do very well for themselves because they focus on having as many offspring as possible. However, there is another strategy that you can employ, and this is called having an equilibrial life history. Equilibrial species are the polar opposite. They reach sexual maturity very, very slowly, and they produce very few offspring. Now, you might say, well, so they take a long time to be able to reproduce, and they produce very few offspring. How could that be an advantage when these other species are producing lots of offspring and they're having generation after generation really, really fast? Well, the reason is because they reach maturity slowly, they can have larger bodies that are very, very hardy. They can live a long time, which means that each individual has more opportunities for mating. It also means that the parents can spend a lot of time taking care of each individual offspring. So although they have few offspring, every single one of those offspring has a much higher likelihood of surviving to adulthood. They are very well cared for, and they are very well positioned to be able to survive to their maximum lifespan, which is not true of opportunistic species. Typically, organisms with equilibrial life histories are large-bodied and long-lived, so think elephants here, a good example. Any kind of large mammal, primates would be a really good example as well, and they typically live to their full lifespan. You can see this mama elephant here protecting her calf. This is classic equilibrial life history behavior, where not only does this mama elephant protect her calf, as a matter of fact, the entire herd of elephants will protect the calf as though it's their own offspring. Now, from an evolutionary standpoint, why would that benefit them, right? If your goal is to get most of your genes into the next generation's gene pool, why would all the other members of the herd protect this other elephant's calf? Well, members of a herd are probably closely related to each other. They're probably family members. So yeah, it helps me from an evolutionary standpoint to protect my offspring, to make sure that my son or daughter survives to adulthood and gets their genes to the next generation, so that I have grandkids essentially, right? That makes me happy. But It would also benefit me if my brother's kids survive to the next generation, because they would be the next most closely related organism to me. They share a good chunk of my genes as well. So this behavior that a lot of animals have, a lot of particularly large mammals have, this pack behavior, this caring for each other, this taking care of each other's kids, this making sure that everyone in the herd is safe and happy, this actually is an evolutionarily advantageous behavior. And not only that, by helping everyone else in the herd helps you as well. So this altruistic behavior ensures that all of the offspring are going to be kept safe, and it's just mutually beneficial. So equilibrial species make sure that their offspring are well taken care of. So we looked at exponential growth, which is the kind of growth pattern you would see in a lot of opportunistic species and any kind of species at all that has basically unlimited resources in its environment, if it has no limiting factors. What are limiting factors? I've used the term a couple times. I've sort of defined it, but let's talk about it more specifically. It's any environmental factor that can hold population growth in check. So if there's a limited amount of food, that's a limiting factor. You can't increase your population size past a certain point because there's just not enough food to support a population larger than the amount of food can sustain. If there's only a certain amount of space in that ecosystem, that's a limiting factor. If there are hunters coming through and clearing out a certain percentage of your population every year, that's going to be a limiting factor. That reduces your overall rate of population growth. So it's anything that holds your population growth down is a limiting factor. And if you have a combination of these things, they're going to add up and overall reduce your rate of population growth, such that removing any one will slightly increase how much you're adding to your numbers every year. If you look at all of the limiting factors for any given species, you get a limit which we call the carrying capacity, which is the maximum population size that the environment can sustain. I've given you the definition before, but here it is written on the slide. So exponential population growth typically is not what you see when these limiting factors are strongly influencing a population. Instead, what you see is logistic population growth. It's a different kind of curve. Logistic population growth occurs when the growth rate decreases as the population size approaches the carrying capacity. Equilibrial species tend to follow this growth pattern a lot more strongly. Remember, we said that the opportunistic species have those boom and bust cycles. So what they do is they have the J-shaped exponential growth pattern followed by a population crash. Then J-shaped population growth pattern, population crash. Here's what the equilibrial species do, though. They have this S-shaped growth pattern. So this is what we call the logistic population growth curve. This is real data taken from fur traders over decades, actually. You can see down here on the x-axis. And it's numbers of furs that they're bringing back. And if you assume that the sampling effort is relatively the same every year, you have the same number of fur trappers, the same number of boats going out, they're spending the same amount of time going out. So if you're adjusting for the amount of sampling effort, the only reason why you would be getting more furs year after year is if there were more seals available year after year, if the number of seals in the area where they were searching was increasing. So this curve shows us that over the years, the number of seals increased, but after a while, it kind of leveled off. And what's happening here? The population starts out really, really low in about 1910, where this starts. And since the population is low, it was like there were unlimited resources on the island where they're trapping these seals. So remember when I talked about the rabbits on Australia, how there's just a few rabbits and they had basically this unlimited space to move into, so there was just, it was like they had no carrying capacity whatsoever. Same thing with these seals, right? There was a very small population on this whole island. They could use all the resources they wanted to. They were so far below the carrying capacity that they experienced J-shaped exponential growth. Any population that is relatively small or has unlimited resources will have J-shaped exponential growth, which is what you see at the beginning. It's J-shaped. But then, as the population increases, the competition for resources starts to increase as well. There's going to be less space available as there's more seals. There's going to be less food available as there's more seals. There's going to be less water available as there's more seals. So they start competing with each other. And remember what I said about competition. It's a negative interaction. It reduces your fitness, and your fitness is related to how much you can reproduce. So if competition reduces your reproductive rate, that means there's going to be fewer births. Fewer births, slower rate of reproduction, the population growth starts slowing down, and you can see that it's no longer J-shaped, but it starts curving off and becomes an S-shaped curve here. It starts going the other way. And at the point where it becomes flat, we have our carrying capacity. I'll put a dotted line here. This is the carrying capacity of that ecosystem. The point at which intraspecific competition for limited resources made it so there could be no more population growth, right? This is a carrying capacity created by density-dependent limiting factors. As the population density got higher, that is, the number of seals on this one island got bigger, the intensity of competition increased to the point where the rate of reproduction was exactly the same as the rate of death, and it evened out, and you got no population growth. So this line went flat. So the J-shaped curve is the exponential growth curve. The S-shaped curve here, this is the logistic growth curve. In the next video, we're going to talk more about intraspecific competition, the effects of these two different growth curves, and density-dependent limiting factors, and something else called a density-independent limiting factor.